Hi everyone, my name is Mrs. McCrary, and in this video I will go over the parts of the brain. So what you should learn from this video is where the parts of the brain are located and their functions. So just to start out with, the brain is the command center of the central nervous system. The brain weighs about 3 pounds and it controls everything, whether it's involuntary functions functions that we aren't in conscious control of, or voluntary functions that we do have conscious awareness of. Our brain controls our heart rate, our brain controls our breathing, our brain houses our memory, our brain is where thoughts and thinking and problem solving take place. And so this is a really complex part of our body. It contains 86 billion neurons, and they use the electrochemical communication system that we've already learned about, these very small neurons that pass an electrical impulse and neurotransmitters across the synapse to communicate with our body. So a very complex organ. I am using a website called brainfacts.org. It's a really awesome website where you can take a digital brain here on their website and you can look at it from all directions, which I really like. And you can even isolate different brain parts, and you can look at that part inside the brain and take off the outer lobes to see that part a little bit better. And so I really like that about this particular website. My students will need to be collecting information about each brain part. They will need to write down the part's function. So what does it do? And they need to know where it's located. I also will ask my students, make sure you write down a memory trick, so something that will help you remember what that brain part does. It's hard to just memorize a bunch of facts that feel random, but if you tie a little memory trick to it, that will help, and I'll try to give you some throughout this video. So what we're going to start with is we're going to start with the brain stem, and so let me stop and isolate that part. All right, so here's the brainstem. You can see the brainstem is there at the core, the very inner parts of the brain. And the brainstem is a bundle of nerve fibers. It actually is several parts all in one. There are 3 structures in there all together, and we're gonna go by structure, and I'll tell you about each part. But that brainstem is responsible for essential functions that are necessary for survival in life. So the first brain part that I will isolate, I'll start at the bottom. It's called the medulla oblongata. And you can see there the medulla is there, like right where the spinal column is connecting into the brain is the medulla. The medulla oblongata is where breathing is controlled. Breathing is just an incredibly essential function for life. And the medulla oblongata, I think of this part as the part that is going to receive the medal for the most important brain part, medulla, medal. The medulla is also responsible for your heartbeat, and that is also an incredibly essential function. So my memory tool for medulla is medal, because you give the MVP, the most important player, you give them a medal. The medulla is responsible for the most important part of our body function, and I'm going to give them that honor of the MVP to receive that medal, medulla, medal. Okay, the next brain part that my students need to know is the pons, and the pons sits directly on top of the medulla. It's a part of the brainstem, and I think it looks a little bit like an Adam's apple. Like if we were to see this as a throat, I think that pons looks like the Adam's apple. So if you're going to identify it on a diagram, it's that lump on top of the medulla. The pons is responsible for sleep. And I think of pons, if I were to put a bunch of Z's after pons, whenever you see like Z's in a comic strip or a cartoon, all of those Z's are usually trying to help you know that that cartoon character is asleep or sleeping. And so I think of pons, sleep. Many of these brain's parts have lots of functions. I want you to remember like one function, but I will probably also mention a few others. The pons is also responsible for attention, but if you remember sleep, you will be good. All right, this particular website does not allow me to isolate the reticular formation, but you do need to know the reticular formation. So I'm going to show you the brainstem as a whole, and I'll talk to you about where it's at. So we can see the whole brainstem here. The reticular formation is actually inside of the brainstem. It actually runs up in between the center of the brainstem. It's called the reticular formation, and it looks a little bit like a very small, like maybe a pinky finger going up inside of the brainstem, like a little straw, little tiny bundle of nerve fibers that goes right up the center of the brainstem. And the reticular formation is responsible for your consciousness. A consciousness, you can be conscious when you're sleeping. Consciousness is your brain activity. So if you think of the difference between being conscious and unconscious, that would be what's happening at our reticular formation. It is responsible for our consciousness, our brain activity. So a very core function at the very center of the brain. All right, next we're going to move upward. My students do not need to know about this brain part that's right here, right at the top, the midbrain, but that is the part that sits right on top of the pons. It separates the brainstem from the limbic system up here. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the limbic system. So I'll show you the whole limbic system here. It's kind of this structure inside the brain. If we were to take these lobes apart, we would see the limbic system in there. And the limbic system is just a group of structures, like all together inside of these structures. Things like emotion and memory and motivation are happening. Our reward center is in there. These are where a plethora of things are occurring, and the limbic system are just structures that are connected to one another. Okay, so let's take apart the limbic system and let's go to the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is a structure in the limbic system that I think it looks a little bit like two arms that are like hugging the inner part of the brain. And so you can see the hippocampus is in there. There are two parts, one on each side. They are identical. And the hippocampus is responsible for your long-term memories. This is where your memories are stored. And so this, for any memory that you have that you can go back and you can recall and draw upon, is being stored in your hippocampus. And I will never forget the function for hippocampus, because I think to myself, if I saw a hippo walking on the school campus, that would be a memory I would never forget. A hippo on campus is pretty memorable, and that would be stored in my memories forever. My hippocampus is my memory storage center, and I would never forget a hippo on campus. Okay, next is the amygdala. And the amygdala, if we think of a hippocampus as arms that are like hugging our inner brain, our inside of our brain here, I think of the amygdala as the little fists on the ends of those arms of the hippocampus. And so you can see the amygdala there. It looks a little bit roundish. They say they're almond shaped, and you can see there's two of them. This is the part of your brain that is an emotional center for your brain, but specifically there's a specific type of emotions that the amygdala is responsible for. Emotions of fear, aggression, anxiety. These are the emotions that are associated with the amygdala. I remember amygdala because amygdala is spelled, the first three letters are A-M-Y, amygdala. And so A-M-Y sounds like Amy to me. So I think of Amy as angry. Angry Amy. The amygdala is responsible for anger, aggression, anxiety, some of these very negative emotions, these fear, fight or flight type of emotions. Angry Amy. The amygdala is responsible for anger and aggression. All right, so next we're going to go on to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is inside the limbic system. The limbic system kind of wraps all around, and the hypothalamus is deep in here, deep in the core. The hypothalamus is responsible for our inner drives to regulate our body functions. So things like hunger, you feel hunger and you feel thirst and you're driven to go satisfy those things. You feel hunger and thirst from your hypothalamus, and it drives you to eat and to drink to keep your body going. It also is this regulating piece. Like, not only does it help you regulate like eating and drinking, but it helps regulate your body temperature, and it helps just keep all of your body going with those drives. So I think of your inner drives: hunger, thirst, body temperature, the things that your body needs to regulate to keep going. And so that's what your hypothalamus does. And so if you think of hypo, maybe you think of hypothermia. Hypothermia might remind you of like a temperature regulation. And so your body needs to regulate your temperature, and your hypothalamus does that. All right, we are going to move on to another part of your brain that's still here kind of like in the lower areas, the lower parts of your brain. And we're going to go on to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is down here at the very bottom. Cerebellum is kind of like, it looks a little bit like the seat that the brain sits on. And you might notice that the textures are a little bit different as well. It's not wrinkly like you see on that outer cover. It's a little bit different. And so you can tell it is separate from that wrinkly, those lobes on top. The cerebellum actually, if in Latin, the cerebellum means little brain. So it's kind of like this little brain that's sitting under the big brain. And even though it's small, it controls really big things. It controls our motor movements. It controls the motions that you have conscious awareness of. So hitting a baseball, writing with your pencil, all kinds of playing the piano, whatever you're doing to operate your body and your emotions and your movement, that any motor skill, that is going to be something that is being communicated and controlled through your cerebellum. And I remember that because I think of cerebellum has the word bell inside of it. And I think of, like, if you think of a little bell sitting on a table, and the little flute part of the bell is sitting on the table and it's got a handle, that bell will not ring unless you move it. And so you need to use your cerebellum back here to pick your arm up, your hand up. You're going to grab onto that bell and you're going to swing that bell, and that bell will make noise, but that is only going to happen if your cerebellum is controlling your motor movements to ring that bell. And so for me to do this with my hand and ring that bell, I have to be using my cerebellum for my motor movements. So that's the cerebellum. I think the cerebellum is easily confused with the cerebrum because they sound very similar, and a lot of times students mix those up on tests because they just have the first part of them sound the same: cerebellum, cerebrum. Okay, in video notes, part 2 of this, the brain parts, part 2, I will go over the parts of the brain that are in the outer parts, that are in the lobes that go into the outer parts of the brain. So make sure to watch the second part of the brain notes, and I will go over the cerebrum, the lobes of the brain, and all of the functions of the outer parts of the brain.